So I know I refer to the textbook, the Reitz and Youngman textbook, a bunch, but I almost never quote from it. But I really, really like their definition of intonation. So that's how I'm going to start this video on intonation. They say intonation is the distinctive use of pitch over units larger than a single word, right? We've talked about the distinctive use of pitch over syllables. Um, we're actually going to talk about distinctive use of pitch over exactly a word at the end of this video, but over larger than a single word, that's intonation. So it's pitch used in the context of phrases. And I think it's worth again reiterating. They give a list from Wells of 6 functions of intonation in English, and some of these are very generalizable to other languages. So we can convey attitude. The speaker can use intonation to convey feelings about their feelings about the content, what they're talking about. We can use it to mark syntactic structures, so it has a grammatical function. We can use pitch to identify new information, and this is marking focus. Uh, it has a discourse function to express connection between different units, to kind of connect and show how the different parts of an utterance relate to each other. Um, Psychological function, we can use pitch to help process sentences. You see this a little bit in caregiver speech where people are talking to children. Sometimes they'll modify their intonation to make it clearer, easier for the children to understand what they're saying. And there's an indexical function that is using pitch to signal deliberately or just automatically something about your identity as a speaker. So let's go through a few of those. Grammatically, one of the most prominent uses of intonation is to identify what kind of sentence you have. And particularly in English, we have a way to signal yes no questions. We commonly do that by a sharp rising intonation at the end of the sentence. So, are you going? Going? You go up at the end, and that signals this is the kind of utterance that someone answers yes or no to. Or you could fall at the end of the sentence. You are going. That's a statement. Or who's going with you? Right? That's actually a question, but it's a WH question. You can't say yes or no to who's going with you. You have to answer more fully. Some people would give a rising intonation. Who's going with you? Who's going with you? It's a little bit more awkward. Usually you have a who's going with you. You have a rise somewhere in the middle. Um, so that rise versus fall at the end is an example of a grammatical function of intonation. One thing that's mentioned in this section of the textbook is declination, which is a tendency, not universal, but very common cross-linguistically, for pitch to fall throughout an utterance. Um, so it's usually this sort of falling slope that other things happen on top of, whether we're emphasizing a particular word or doing that rise at the end or that kind of thing. So another function is discourse, so connecting things. I'm going to give a concrete illustration here. This is an instance of me reading. We divide the field roughly into articulatory, perceptual, and acoustic phonetics. And what you see here in this pitch track is that when we start the list, the pitch goes high. It still stays higher than it was for the middle element in the list. And it's only when we get to the final element in the list that the pitch then drops back down to the where it was declining to all along. So that final fall indicates the end of the list. And that's an example of a discourse function where you use this, you sort of control when the pitch goes where to show which things belong together, in this case, the list. Indexically, so the textbook identifies uptalk. This is a favorite example of linguists over a certain age as an example of the indexical function of intonation. And it's a fine example. It remains a fairly clear dividing line between younger and older speakers, but I have to say, over my life, I'm now 40 something, and uptalk is still pretty common in my generation, maybe not widespread. See, I just did it. So younger in this case, it's an ever advancing threshold, right? As the generation on that threshold ages, what counts as younger gets older and older year by year. And I point this out to remind you that some differences between social groups, these indexical differences, uh, can often be just early signs of some historical shift underway. And it's especially true if what they index is speakers' ages rather than, say, region of origin or uh, social or economic status, right? In this case, it's quite plausible that in a generation or two, what we'll see is we've had a change in the grammatical function of intonation, right? That uptalk just becomes that's the way that you end declarative sentences. Uh, and so, yeah, time will tell. But it's worth keeping in mind. But it definitely, at least at this point in time, that's an example of an indexical function of intonation. Right. So I want to finish this video with a discussion of pitch accent. Um, it's an interesting category of language. Pitch accent languages, they're a bit like stress languages. And how are they like stress languages? They're like them because one syllable is marked out as distinctive. But stress is normally signaled by a combination of pitch, duration, amplitude, vowel quality. Uh, Pitch accent is primarily, often exclusively, signaled just with pitch. So it's not quite like stress. Pitch accent languages are a bit like tone languages in that the pitch patterns on the syllable are what distinguish words. But tone languages assign a particular tone or tone pattern to each syllable. In a pitch accent language, one syllable in the word is assigned a special pitch pattern, and then that kind of determines all the rest get the other pitch pattern, some other default pattern, right? So what happens on that one syllable determines what happens everywhere else, while in a tone language, each syllable gets its own tonal identity. So to step back a bit, we often distinguish between stress languages, tone languages, and pitch accent languages. But it is important to note that there are languages that show evidence of multiple categories at once. So there are these three categories, but don't think of them as strictly exclusive, mutually exclusive categories. That's all. So this video, we've looked at intonation, patterns of pitch that extend over units larger than a single word. We've looked at some of the roles of intonation in English and in other languages. Uh, and we've also had a brief look at pitch accent languages.